Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the Yale Development Dialogues, a series convening economists, historians, and policymakers to discuss some of the most pressing issues confronting developing countries. I'm Catherine Cheney. I'm a senior reporter at DevX, and I'll be your moderator today as we ask the big question: is it time to reimagine sustainable development? So, as many of you know, the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly opens today. And leaders from around the world will be meeting virtually and in person to discuss progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. So as a reporter focused on technology and innovation in global health and international development, I often refer to the SDGs really as a way to capture the issues that I cover. At DevX, our motto and mission is do good, do it well, and we cover what is really a global development industry. I see journalism as a way to highlight what is working and what isn't when it comes to making progress on the SDGs, spreading the best ideas and holding the sector accountable, which I think will be critical in making progress on these ambitious goals. But today we actually ask, do these goals make sense? Are they the best way to set ambitions, to measure progress, to hold the world to account? For those who are less familiar, and I'll just give a little bit of background before our panelists expand on this. The SDGs are a list of 17 interlinked global goals. They were adopted by the United Nations member states in 2015, and they focus on everything from tackling poverty and inequality to improving health and education, issues like water, sanitation, clean energy, climate action, industry and infrastructure, decent work, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and finally, Goal 17, partnerships to achieve all these goals. There are specific targets for each goal and indicators to measure progress, with this deadline of 2030. The SDGs serve really as a blueprint for how to solve the world's greatest challenges, but they're also the subject of intense debate. And I actually think the COVID-19 pandemic, among other things, has led more people to ask, how realistic are the SDGs? Do they measure the right things? And how can they really hold up in the face of crises like COVID-19 and climate change? So today we're joined by several experts on the issue. I'm excited to hear from them on exactly how we should reimagine sustainable development. I'll go ahead and introduce them. Stefan Dercon is professor of economic policy at the Blavatnik School of Government and the economics department at the University of Oxford. He's also policy advisor to Dominic Raab, the UK's Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs, and First Secretary of State. Between 2011 and 2017, he was the chief economist of the Department of International Development, where Rory Stewart was as well. You'll hear about him in a moment. We're also joined by Shanta Devarajan. He's professor of the practice of development at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, and his previous positions include senior director for development economics and former acting chief economist of the World Bank Group. He was a director of the World Development Report 2004, Making Services Work for Poor People, and I'm sure he'll draw on some of those insights. And finally, Rory Stewart, one of the three co-organizers of the Yale Development Dialogues, is a senior fellow at Yale-Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, where he focuses on contemporary politics and crisis and international development and intervention in fragile and conflict-affected states. Lately, he's been very busy with Afghanistan, as you might imagine. He was previously the UK's Secretary of State for International Development, and in that role, he doubled the UK's investment in climate and the environment. Now, the three of these panelists have worked very closely together over the years, and as one of the organizers of the Yale Development Dialogues, Rory has really taken the lead on framing this session and saying, this is why we need to have this conversation, and this is why now. So before I go to Rory, I just want to note, we really love to hear from our audience. We always have great questions from you all. So while I definitely have some questions prepared, please throw your questions into the Q&A function on Zoom, and I'll get to as many as I can. But Rory, I do want to start with you here. This big question, is it time to reimagine sustainable development? This really came from you. And, I think you picked the perfect people in Stefan and Shanta to discuss this big question. So can you expand on why this question, why now? Why is it so critical we have this discussion today?
I think the first thing, thank you all very much for having me. And I obviously want to spend more time giving you all time to speak rather than myself. But I think one thing as an ex-politician, which is important to frame, is the ways in which things like the SDGs emerge. It isn't simply that very distinguished development economists like Shanta or Stefan sit down and try to think in the most clear-sighted, logical way about the most efficient research they've done on how to do development well. What in fact happens with the SDGs, of course, is that it is primarily a response to another set of goals called the Millennium Development Goals that came about in 2000 and which by 2015 were looking a little bit tired. So in 2015, there was another pump to get everything going again, this time with a target of 2030. And underlying an enormous amount of what's going on is a funny combination of academic literature and research, right, which is transforming these goals, so taking them from the 8 goals with the Millennium Development Goals up to 17 and new things emerging. If you dig under the surface of it, a lot of what's happening in the SDGs is a sort of critique of the MDGs. So one big change is suddenly these goals become universal. They relate not just to developing countries, they relate to all the countries in the world. So the United States, the United Kingdom is supposed to be signing up to pursue these sustainable development goals. Much more emphasis on things like peace building, governance, human rights, much more emphasis on the private sector, much more evidence on biodiversity on land and sea. Right? Why did these changes happen in 2015? Well, because people obviously felt 2 things there. One of them is here are things which are excluded that we care about, like biodiversity. Second thing, of course, there is a political pushback from people saying this shouldn't simply be countries in the north telling countries in the south how to behave. We should all be trying to pursue these goals. So become more universal, become more comprehensive, also become far more ambitious. Suddenly there is a commitment not to halving things like poverty and hunger, there's commitments to getting to 0 on these things. And new forms of measurement come in to try to guess how effective they are. And I, as a working politician, found this absolutely central to what I was doing. So I would turn up at the UN General Assembly. I did a big session as the Secretary of State on the Sustainable Development Goals, gave a speech on it. There were a whole series of different events at the UN General Assembly around them. And we all talked solemnly about those things within them which we liked. So for me as a politician, obviously, I was particularly excited at the emphasis on climate and biodiversity. So I put a huge emphasis on that when I was talking to other people. I'm very interested in the shift just from talking about education, talking about the quality of education. Right? Other people extremely excited that really it allows them to get into issues like governance, human rights, in a much more direct way. But somewhere in the background are, Professor Devarajan and Professor Dercon sitting there looking at this and saying, out of all this mess of all these things generated by politicians, by citizens, by lobby groups, by NGOs, all of whom are feeding into this process, what is getting lost? What's been excluded from this? Right? Have we lost sight, for example, as Stefan might say, on a focus on poverty? Or have we lost sight on a focus on economic growth? Or have we lost sight on a focus of actually what works and what doesn't work? Because I think, and it's on this that I'm going to hand over to the other panelists, I think somewhere within this, of course, the great fundamental point, which is that ought implies can. You don't have a moral obligation, do what you can't do. And therefore, the fundamental question of what works and what doesn't work is somehow concealed in a series of incredibly idealistic statements about how we would like the world to be. And on that, I hand over.
Thank you, Rory. Stefan, I do want to bring you into this. And first of all, I know you, as we critique the goals, because I do want to start with a critique, because before we propose solutions, we need to understand the problem here. I know, one, the goals are idealistic, as Rory said, and would love for you to expand on that. And 2, in terms of who they are relevant for, Rory mentioned as a politician from the UK, going to the UN General Assembly, this was a useful blueprint. It served a purpose, and he was able to use these goals as a framework, but perhaps not so relevant or useful for everyone. So can you jump in on your experience in terms of how the goals have emerged and whether they make sense?
Well, thank you very much. And look, what is there to dislike about the SDGs? We should only celebrate them. We have 0 poverty in there, 0 hunger. Poverty is still there as SDG 1. We have learning for all. We have economic opportunities for all, but also lots more attention to planet, to biodiversity, to climate issues and so on. We have there something quite remarkable, kind of a vision for Sweden in the whole world, a beautiful blueprint for the world. And we got all the leaders in the world to sign up for this. What more? Actually, the job is done, maybe we're there. And this is a bit like, well, I find it actually really quite problematic. Okay, and there's a number of things that fundamentally get lost by celebrating and only celebrating and the way we talk about it and the way they do it. So it's not that I'm against the SDGs. I think indeed it's about their relevance and what we've actually lost. So for me, maybe 3 points to make. So the first one is, Rory mentioned the Millennium Development Goals. There is the Millennium Development Goals, they came out of the Millennium Summit, and there's this famous photograph. It's probably the only time in the global history that so many leaders in the world were on the same photograph. I counted them, 149 heads of states. It was signed by 189 leaders. They signed up to these MDGs, and indeed, Rory said they weren't perfect, but they were the beginning, and then the SDGs were there. Now, I have a problem with that photograph because I look at that, and yes, I see there, decent people. I see Kofi Annan there, I see Tony Blair, I see Bill Clinton, Jacques Chirac. Maybe I don't agree with all of them. It's there. You see Jiang Zemin from China, you see Putin there as well. But actually, you start looking further, and then you see people that have been put in front of the International Court of Justice. You have incredible groups that came to power with massive violence and continue to perpetrate massive violence. You have terribly corrupt leaders there as well, and so on. And then you ask yourself, well, what's the point of signing up to the SDGs or the MDGs? What's the point? Of course, for those who are decent leaders and who want growth and development in their country, and of course, no country is perfect. There is no Sweden in the world, really, in that kind of idealized way. But for them, it's just fine. It's business as usual. This is what we try to do. And especially with the SDGs, we can pick and choose. And so there's enough for us. We can do something. It's good. But it doesn't make any difference. Now, for the countries where it really would matter, where poverty is terrible, where economic opportunities are dreadful, where there's no learning for all, where there is terrible attention to biodiversity, who cares? Nobody is held to account for it. Calling them out on the SDGs doesn't mean anything. So it's basically, for the countries where it would matter most, it doesn't do anything. Now, you could say, maybe it's not what we have. And maybe the second point is we should just be conscious that it's probably, in the end, this is really in the end for rich countries. This is basically rich countries to have an accountability framework for what they do in the world. So indeed, I know that definitely for the MDGs, the SDGs, when Rory was my boss in Secretary of State, it mattered for DFID at the time. It mattered. You would look at it, are we doing what we're doing and so on. So maybe that's not so bad. And actually, we can attest to that. It focused more on outcomes and on progress. But again, for whom is it relevant? Does it really matter for those who fundamentally we should really then care about? And it leads me to the final thing, and that's actually where it then really gets problematic for me. We see then the UN setting out, we have the SDGs, now it's going to cost you 5 to 7 trillion to achieve them. And every time again, that's what we hear, and it's going to cost us that much, as if there's a supermarket for SDGs where we can go and buy them and then achieve our results in the world. Now, there isn't that supermarket. In fact, people making these calculations, in fact, Shanta, you may want to defend yourself later, did one of the first calculations of how much it was for the MDGs. You've disowned it. You have made the original sin there and you've clearly put it aside now and you've confessed your sins. But it's fine. But, you get this impression that that's what you can do. And actually, if we go back to the countries where it should matter most, it's not money that's the problem. It's actually fundamentally, groups that are in power, economic and political deals that are entirely focused on rent sharing for themselves. As Shanta itself is quoted in a blog to say, what would it cost to get development in the DRC? Probably infinity, because there's no amount of money that you can spend at a time on President Kabila, who wasn't interested in growth and development. Apparently, he was only interested in computer games and making a lot of money. You can spend whatever you want. It doesn't make progress. So what's the relevance if we focus on the wrong countries and actually keep on focusing just on development is just something you can buy. And it's just about spending massive amounts of money, and that's all that counts. I'll stop now.
Thank you, Stefan. And perfect transition to Shanta. And I will say, Shanta, I know you have been quite upfront about, the challenge of putting a price tag on this. In fact, in preparation for this conversation, I read a blog post you wrote, "Shame on me, why it was wrong to cost the MDGs." And here we are doing the same for the SDGs, despite the challenges that Stefan outlined. So can you expand on this a little bit when it comes to the problems with the SDGs? Why is this costing issue part of the problem? And perhaps you have more to add to that.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. This is a real pleasure and an honor to be in this august group. The problem is actually, if we go back to the Millennium Development Goals that both Rory and Stefan mentioned, let's be honest, they were essentially an attempt to raise funds for foreign aid. And basically the taxpayers in rich countries were asking, what are we paying for all of this foreign aid? And they came up with a set of goals saying we're trying to reduce child mortality and increase primary enrollment and so on. And in a narrow sense, it worked. It did raise foreign aid, almost doubled foreign aid during that period. The problem is that we got trapped into this situation, which Stefan alluded to, thinking that that's all it took was to get the foreign aid, and then we would be done. Which was the point I was trying to make in that blog post. But I think it's actually worse than that. By focusing on the money, it takes away from what is the critical component, which is the accountability of these governments to their own people. The problem is if you say, here's $50 billion, which was our estimate for the MDGs, and now it's 5 trillion, was it, for the SDGs. If you say, well, that's what it's going to take, then there's no attempt for the heads of state to actually tell their people, oh, we have to make all these tough decisions. Because the reason we are not making progress on the SDGs is that they're not coming up with the money. So it gets governments off the hook rather than actually being able to hold them accountable for delivering on these goals. So I think the focus on the billions to trillions is actually doing harm, not even that it's misguided, not just that it's misguided. But let me say, on a positive note, the other thing is that we have learned quite a bit about how to make public spending effective over the years. So the other problem, of course, was that if you just have the money, it doesn't mean you're going to get to these goals. On the other hand, a lot of people have been doing very important research on how to deliver on public services. And there, I would say that I'd like to see more effort by governments to work with communities. There's quite a lot of rigorous evidence now that actually having communities monitor service providers can actually lead to better outcomes, like reduced child mortality. Transparency of information is another critical component. When people know what it is that they're supposed to get and what it is they're actually getting, they mobilize and they start demanding efforts. And let's be very frank, different ways of avoiding the political capture of public finance. That's the problem we have. That's Stefan alluded to DR Congo, but we have that problem everywhere, including to some extent in the United States, of political capture. Now, there are societies that have tried to get around it, including things like using electronic transfer of social protection payments that make it much harder. It doesn't eliminate it, but it makes it much harder for people to steal it before it gets to the intended beneficiary. So we have a big agenda here. Let's put the SDGs aside for a minute and say, how do we actually help improve people's lives? And I think the agenda is critical today because we also have this COVID crisis. And in the middle of the COVID crisis, there's been a big push to increase public spending on health, on education, on social protection, all for very good reasons. There's no question that you need more resources. But if we spend it the way we've been spending it in the past, we're not going to solve the COVID crisis. And that crisis can blow up. So I want to say, for the COVID crisis itself, let's use what we've learned about increasing effectiveness of public spending, but more generally for the SDGs, let's drop the discussion of trillions and let's talk about effectiveness.
Thank you for that. Rory, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so just to try to draw some of these themes together. So I think that the first thing is somewhere underlying the way in which we think about not just development, but almost everything we do in our society, is we have an idea that somehow we have a plan, right, some sort of template, and if we just put enough money and resources behind it, we can sort it out. And we're particularly prone to this idea when we're dealing with somebody else's country. If you actually were charged with trying to work with a ex-coal community in East Kentucky, you might be a little bit more cautious about thinking that you had some universal template and plan and you were just going to come in. And if you put enough money behind it, the whole thing will be sorted out. Now, why is it we have this thought? Well, it's partly because we find it very difficult politically, and this is me speaking as a politician, to talk publicly about how difficult development progress is. Right? The reality is, of course, that all these programs involve partial failures, partial success, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, many things don't work out. But we don't want to say that to the public. What we want to say to the public is, we have a plan, this is what we're going to do, this is this beautiful utopian vision, and if you just give us enough money, we'll get behind it. And it's particularly strange in the US context, because in the US context, the marketing, so Stefan talked about this idea about development being like a supermarket where you turn up and for a few trillion you buy something. But the other dimension that Stefan maybe hasn't emphasized enough is the marketing of the product in the supermarket, right? What's above the shelf? And in the case of the US, right from the very beginning of the development project under Truman in the 1940s, the marketing has been about scaring the American people. Right? He actually says when he's launching Point 4, a congressman says to him, we've got to scare the hell out of people. So it's all framed in terms of communism. And an enormous amount that then follows in terms of US development spend. And of course, a lot of the drivers of this in the 40s and 50s, it's not European countries, it's the United States, is arranged around this fear. We have the same phenomenon in Afghanistan recently around counterterrorism. Right? And it is reinforced by a desire to have a simple mission that you can explain to the public. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is that if you arrange all your programs around this sort of simple, rather targeted mission, which markets well, which sells well, which, as Shanta says, is a good way of getting people to reach into their pockets. As soon as that narrative begins to fray, there is a real risk that you're going to abandon everything. So obviously, we've just seen this with President Biden in Afghanistan. As soon as people are no longer confident that there are terrorists in Afghanistan, suddenly we're not going to do any development in Afghanistan, right? We hand the thing over to the Taliban, we leave the country entirely, we're going to impose sanctions, and 40 million Afghans end up being much, much worse off now. What is the alternative to that? Well, to loop back to where we began, the alternative would have to be to work out how to produce something which is neither the extreme optimism of the SDGs and the MDGs, these sort of incredible utopian statements about plans and money, nor a total grim, pessimistic, we can't do anything, the whole world is impossible, but actually began to articulate imaginatively and practically what it would mean to work in different countries in different contexts. Right? What does it mean to work in Rwanda, right, which is a development success story but has serious human rights problems? What does it mean to work in Ethiopia, which seemed to be a development success story with serious human rights problems and now looks very different to what it looked like 3 years ago? Right? What does it feel like to work in Ghana, which some development economists don't want you to work in because it's approaching middle income status and it's no longer poor enough? What does it feel like to work in Pakistan, where actually international aid has very little leverage because Pakistan's too big? Its economy is too large for Pakistani politicians to want to pay much attention to what any outsider is saying. What does it feel like to work in South Sudan, where Salva Kiir effectively is prepared to turn around to the international community and say, if you want to cut off the aid, I don't mind, because the people who are going to suffer are just the people in the refugee camps and the clinics and schools. I'm not interested in this project at all. So it's producing something which is much more located in a place and a time, and is much more located in questions of local power and politics. In other words, to quote my favorite World Bank report produced 4 or 5 years ago, the entire framework that underlies this, which is that somewhere there is a best practice and all we need to do is do capacity building and find political will, is deeply, deeply misleading. Right? In the end, all of this comes down to local context, local power, and local politics with a capital P. Right, over to the others.
Thank you, Rory. I mean, I think that is so well put, and I'm typing as you go because it just helps reframe how I look at these issues as a reporter. You know, on the one hand, Stefan has mentioned that the SDGs are a bit like a blueprint for building Sweden all over the world. And so it's hard to critique that idealistic vision. And yet that is problematic for the reasons Rory just outlined, that it really isn't just that we have best practices we can replicate globally. Every place is different, context matters. And so how do we reimagine that? I mean, that's the big question we're tasked with today. I wonder, Shanta or Stefan, have you been in rooms or perhaps been leading these conversations yourselves in terms of, if this is not the right blueprint moving forward, what might a better plan look like? Or is a global plan just unrealistic and this has to be place by place? I think the challenge there is that doesn't really bring the world together, which is one of the goals of the SDGs. But thoughts for what reimagining this actually might look like, or what conversations are happening along those lines? Shanta, do you want to jump in first?
Sure. I think what we should be having is a conversation about reimagining aid, because the real source of the problem is we are still thinking of aid as a financial transfer. And that's what, as Rory says, when that financial transfer is such a small fraction of the economy, as in Pakistan, they think that aid is not effective. On the other hand, think about it. If we generate an idea about scholarships for getting girls into school that actually spreads throughout the country, that is an enormous contribution to Pakistan's economic development. And it could be an idea coming from outside, it could be coming from Yale University, for instance. And we should be thinking, if that's where aid is really effective, that's what aid is needed. The trouble is, there's really not a lot of money associated with that idea. So the politicians will have trouble going and explaining that to the public, that here we developed this idea that's going to get girls into school in Pakistan, and that's our aid contribution. So we really have to switch around. And if you asked about conversation, this was almost my refrain at the World Bank, especially when I was acting chief economist, which is that I wanted the president of the World Bank, whenever he gets on TV, whenever he gives his press statement, not to start with the amount of money they have lent. Let's start with how many girls have we gotten into school, or how many children have we prevented from malnutrition, or at the very least, what are the 3 or 4 ideas we have generated that might get girls into school or improve child nutrition? And say, oh, by the way, some of this costs money, and this is how much money we're prepared to lend. But I have failed. I mean, you see, even in the COVID response, every speech David Malpass gives starts with the $60 billion or whatever that the World Bank has pledged. Meanwhile, there are Africans dying of COVID who are, in some sense, the clients of the World Bank. And this 60 billion doesn't mean much to them at this point.
It's such a great point. And, I often think about the SDGs through the lens of the role of journalism. And I do feel that's part of the problem in how this narrative is covered as well, is journalists jump onto the numbers, like this much was committed. But the key questions are, well, where did the money go? And what actually resulted? And, weeks after the press release, when we've moved on to other stories, not following those commitments. I think that's a critical part of actually making progress. I want to remind our audience that we really want to hear from you all with questions. I see a few starting to come in, but just go ahead and submit in the Q&A function, and you can let me know if you want your name to be shared, or if you prefer to be anonymous, that's fine too, but we want to bring in your voices. Stefan, I want to go to you in terms of, could this be a turning point? And if so, where do you hope things will lead?
Yeah, no, so let's, picking up on where also Rory was, is that, and I do totally agree with him of this importance of starting from place and time, and just even Catherine, I just wish that journalists maybe should stop publishing all these big announcements and pledges that everybody made in money terms, because I definitely in the last 10 years have failed to stop my politicians, and I'm sorry, Rory, including you, to actually keen to announce these big numbers all the time. And it seems to be, yes, it is a problem. It's an endless set of announcements. Yesterday we heard 1 billion pledged on humanitarian aid for Afghanistan. I don't know what it means. And I honestly don't know what it means. And so anyway, but starting from that, trying to build this, I think the way I would like to think about, and in the end, because we are outsiders, and a lot of what we do is outsiders, we need to kind of always be conscious of that. So starting from a particular place and time, I would always start from trying to understand, and that's what I would tell also our teams on the ground, understand the nature of the commitment that in that country exists for things like sustainable growth and development and poverty alleviation. Just understand, where does the political elite want to go? Where does it want to go? Now, that's an important question, because we usually don't start with that. We usually think, oh, we're going to buy some outcomes or do some outcomes. Now, spending money well is really important, but actually without that understanding, we will forget properly to assess it, because I think there's always should be two tests of anything that's happening, and it's whether it's public spending in the country or outside to bring resources in, is that, of course, we should be keen on making sure that the money is used effectively, that outcomes are being generated. And, that's a good thing about the SDGs, at least it talks about the outcomes and it doesn't talk about some kind of inputs. But at the same time, ask yourself, while you do this, is this the best way of using your resources to create at least a chance that the underlying commitment to development in the political space will start improving? And actually, when they're dealing with the case that Rory says, if you do it in South Sudan, you have to ask yourself, do I give an excuse to Salva Kiir or Machar to actually ignoring entirely what we're doing? I remember being actually once as a DFID person going to rebel-held territory, applauding that we were spending so much on health and education. And this guy said, yes, so I don't have to care about these things. Now, that's a real issue. Now, there's other countries where Ethiopia a decade ago, where you could say, look, they wanted to try to do something. Yes, maybe it didn't succeed in the way we wanted it, but you can work with them in doing it. So you have a sense of that underlying commitment, and you use your resources not just to buy some outcomes. Of course, spend your money well, but keep on thinking, am I nudging this country forward in terms of an underlying commitment to development? And yeah, that's probably how I would think about it.
Thanks, Stefan. I want to bring a question in from our audience, unless Rory or Shanta, you wanted to respond to that. Otherwise, we're going to go to some questions from the audience. But Rory, did you want to jump in?
Well, let me come in very quickly. I mean, I think the other thing to understand is there's always the counterfactual. So this is the boring thing about life, is that if one imagines in practice what would really be involved in saying we're not going, I mean, Stefan's of course right. I mean, there's not much point reinforcing failure. Obviously, there's not much point trying to help somebody who doesn't really want you to help them. Not much point trying to believe that giving money to Salva Kiir is going to really lead to much. But the problem is that is very, very difficult for us to bear. Because what would that really mean? That would effectively say, well, actually, basically all the money we're spending in South Sudan is a complete waste of time. So what? Are we not going to spend money on South Sudan? And let me give an example that really struck me most directly. Stefan's point, which is a really good one about the elites, isn't just true of the national elites, also true in many of these countries, that there will be differences between different local elites. So in Afghanistan, for example, from 2001 to 2021, 3 million people in the Bamiyan province in central Afghanistan were extremely keen to work with the international community. They had good local leaders. All the investment we put in went a very long way. There was a fantastic explosion of high quality schools. Hazara women were going to university. There was some fantastic economic development projects. But of course, we put almost no money into that area. Why did we put no money into that area? Because that was the peaceful area of Afghanistan. Instead, the pressure was to pump all the money into the insurgency areas in the south. The argument being, all these people are trying to kill us. And the reason they're trying to kill us is because there's not enough economic development. They're all unemployed. So if we can just generate some more economic activity in Kandahar and Helmand, then obviously people won't join the Taliban. They'll love the Afghan government more and our job will be done for us, right? Now, imagine if I'd won my argument with Hillary Clinton. I tried, directly with Secretary Clinton to make the Stefan argument. I said, why are we wasting our money in southern Afghanistan? Because nothing you're doing is sustainable. If you build a bridge, it gets blown up. Your development workers can't visit these projects. Why don't we put the money into the communities in the center and the north that want to work with us? In fact, communities in the center and north are saying to me, what do I have to do? Do I have to kill some American soldiers? Do I have to let off a bomb? And what do I have to do to get some development assistance? But of course, you can also understand, as I tell this story, exactly why it was impossible for me to win that argument. And why it's almost unbearable for people to say, okay, we're going to turn our back on southern, eastern Afghanistan because it's too complicated, and we'll put our money into the peaceful parts.
Thank you, Rory. I'm glad we're zooming in on Afghanistan in particular in terms of how it highlights some of the big problems with sustainable development and with aid, as Shanta said. I want to touch on a question we got from the audience, and I think it builds on a point Rory was making earlier. Rory, you were talking about how basically it's problems seem easier to solve when they're far away. And I see that all the time in my reporting. So, for example, many donors in the US supporting global education efforts, and increasingly with the SDGs, we're trying to capture not just butts in seats, right, attendance, but learning, actual outcomes. Shanta, I know this is something that you've written on as well, that all this money is spent for education, and yet, you know, kids at a certain age can't read basic sentences. And so the question, just to sort of recap what someone had sent in, is essentially, if this is a problem that, you know, people closer to these contexts are better positioned to solve problems, right? And I write about this a lot too, like local innovators are best positioned to address, say, education challenges in their country. And yet that's not where the money is. That's what Shanta mentioned earlier, right? So I guess the question for you all is, how do we take steps when it comes to reimagining aid from top-down donor countries giving money with little oversight as to where that money actually goes and how it results in real outcomes, to more, as is often described, bottom-up, locally developed solutions, working to target problems, more proximity in problem solving and funding. Of course, the challenge is that's not where really the money lies. So in many of the contexts where we really need to make progress on the SDGs, if that's the useful framework, that's not necessarily where the money exists to solve the problem. So ultimately it does come from far away. So thoughts on how we change that paradigm? Go ahead, Shanta.
So let me suggest yet another outrageous idea, but it's actually being practiced in a few places. You know, Rory mentioned, you know, Salva Kiir is not interested in dealing with donors, but the people of South Sudan are desperately in need of some assistance, regardless of, you know, what the leadership thinks. Right? And if we are essentially interested in helping the people, why not find a way to get the aid to the people without having to go through the government? So the version of that is cash transfers, universal basic transfers. And I would do the thought experiment, take the current amount of aid going to any country and convert it into cash transfers that goes to every citizen of the country, and ask which of those two models is going to generate more development. And I think, I said, this sounds radical, although it's been proposed by many people over the years. But I think the USAID has now introduced this as a benchmark. You know, is to say, whenever you do a project, you have to answer the question: would it be better to take this money and give it out as a pure cash transfer, simply as a technical exercise? But I suspect that in real life, we would get a lot more development. We may have a lot of unemployed bureaucrats and World Bank officials, but nevertheless, we can get more development this way, and it may be worth trying.
I'm really glad you brought up cash transfers, and I want to stay on that topic for a moment, because when we talk about ideas to reimagine aid, you are absolutely right that cash transfers, when initially suggested, seems like a crazy idea to a lot of people. and yet now is really becoming a benchmark for donor agencies. And I'll throw out there, just in terms of how quickly this has happened. So I started covering tech and innovation and global development coming up on 7 years ago. And one of the groups I wrote about was Give Directly, which is really a pioneer in cash transfers. And Give Directly had this revolutionary idea to just give people cash and see what they do with it. And I think part of why it didn't initially take off, or there was some discomfort in the global development community, is it leads people to ask, why not cash, for all the different programs they're implementing. If cash becomes the benchmark and what they are doing, their livelihoods at development agencies, at NGOs, isn't performing better than just giving people money, you know, that may leave them out of a job. So I think it was quite disruptive, quite controversial. And I would just throw out there, as someone who covers tech and innovation in this space, I think part of the challenge with reimagining aid is there's a whole industry built up around foreign aid, global development, and jobs at stake. And you know, people don't necessarily want to address the status quo if it's not in their personal best interest. Perhaps I'm being a little controversial here, but I know we want to generate some real dialogue and debate in this series. And yet, you know, there's no better time than now, it seems, given the crises we've mentioned, to really take a hard look at how this industry works and how to make it work better. So sticking on cash transfers, whether we want to talk about cash transfers or other disruptive ideas and why they haven't taken hold. I think Rory and Stefan want to jump in on that.
I mean, cash transfers is a big subject. I think it's true, of course, as Shanta says, that there are many development programs that are so useless that you would be better dropping cash out of a helicopter than bothering to do it in the first place. I mean, the many projects where we spend hundreds of millions and achieve absolutely nothing, that's for sure. I think there is a distinction to be made within cash transfers. I think cash transfers in a humanitarian context makes an enormous amount of sense. It makes a huge amount of sense to say, rather than the United States shipping over wheat from the United States, you give somebody some money and they go and buy what they actually want and need, which might be a tent or might be something else in the local market. I think cash transfers also make an enormous amount of sense when it is a larger cash transfer as a one-off payment. If you were, for example, to give $250 to a poor woman in a community in Bangladesh, and it allowed her to buy some livestock or set up a small shop, there's good credible evidence that over a year or two, she might be able to significantly improve her savings and investment. Right? However, I am much more skeptical about the idea of essentially trying to run other people's social welfare systems. And there are two reasons for that. Right? So the third, one's humanitarian, second is trying to set up a small business. The third is basically saying, here are, for example, in Pakistan, elderly people or disabled people, and we are simply going to fund the Pakistan government, giving them $30 a month. Right? What is the problem with that? The first problem is one of scale. The economies of the developing world are now roughly the same size as the economies of the developed world. And even if we spent 0.7% of our GDP in the developing world on the developed world on developing world, we'd only be contributing 0.7%, obviously, of their GDP. We couldn't begin to provide the kind of cash required to run social welfare systems. But there's a more fundamental problem, which is, I think it would be politically reckless. It would actually destroy public support for international development programs over time. Because you are effectively saying to a grandmother in Arkansas, I'm going to take $20 out of your pocket this month, and I'm going to put it directly in the pocket of somebody else at the other end of the world. And this is not how people envisage development. Right? People, if they think about development at all, were brought up to think this is all about not giving somebody a fish, it's about teaching them to fish. They thought about development in terms of technical assistance, as Shanta said, bringing ideas, bring infrastructure investments, doing productive investments that generate much more than the dollar's return for a dollar's investment. And you cannot sustain, I think, the idea that the public will get itself into the world as simply funding with its own cash social welfare systems in other people's countries when they're struggling, they feel, to fund social welfare programs in their own countries. I think it's a very dangerous thing for people to do, even if there was evidence that these approaches were sustainable.
Smart point. Stefan, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, no, just look, and having lived through what Rory is also describing in terms of, you know, well, I recognize it. So look, you know, when we're talking what is most effective as aid, I totally agree with Shanta. I mean, we have a huge amount of evidence that it's good for people. It's and it solves in some sense a fundamental aid effectiveness problem. I recognize what Rory describes. I would actually say Give Directly didn't quite invent it. I think DFID was doing it for a long time beforehand, but that's another matter. But it is, but I think a bigger problem I would have with it is that while it solves a problem for aid, it doesn't solve development and growth. And now it is possible that we want to be skeptical about outsiders able to influence development and growth and therefore go for these aid effectiveness. And that's maybe where the South Sudan example is not a bad one. I probably am still more ambitious what you want to be with aid. You know, I don't want to be as gloomy as Bill Easterly and co, so kind of that vision. So you want to try it. So I'm very supportive. I would also say, look, you know, we haven't reached the end to also trying out and doing better with cash transfers, because Rory mentioned humanitarian. It's still a massive battle to get humanitarian agencies to be willing to use cash. And it's amazing things you can do. Just, you know, we were recently involved in Bangladesh in a fascinating thing with cash transfers, where we managed to get cash transfers in the pockets of people 5 days before the floods peaked during a flood crisis. Because we could use forecast models on the floods and we could basically manage to give them cash before the crisis hit. So, you know, can do all kinds of things. But all these things are very much outsiders. I'm still a strong believer in the end development there has to be societal ownership of development. And this is unfortunately then saying, well, we don't have an answer to this. I will need to still find something to do. Because we shouldn't forget, and it comes back actually to a point that Shanta made earlier, most of the resources in development are actually the government's resources. In education, it's more than 90% of the resources in low and middle income countries that actually will be the government's own resources. Finding ways of getting them used well for the benefit of people, I think that's still a big task of us of trying to see, can we help to unlock this? Cash transfers will give us aid effectiveness, but it will not give us development, let alone growth.
Go ahead, Shanta, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so this is a perfect segue because I wanted to pick up on Rory's very valid point that if you go with aid as cash transfers, that's still a drop in the bucket in terms of the large countries and so on. But really, comes back to the question of an idea. Why not use cash transfers for the government's own programs? I mean, I did a calculation, colleagues of mine and I did a calculation about the oil-rich countries in Africa. These are, you know, Nigeria, Gabon, Angola. They're all very wealthy in terms of oil and very poor in terms of development. And we did a calculation that said, suppose you took 20% of their oil revenues and handed it out as cash transfers equally to the entire population. In the low population countries like Gabon, Angola, to some extent Angola, Equatorial Guinea, you could eliminate poverty. You could achieve goal 1 tomorrow with that. That shows you the extent of misspending of public resources. And then the question, and I think Rory was alluding to this about the political support for aid, the real question is, of course, development is not just about people having money to spend on food and clothing and things like that. It's all about public goods. And presumably that's why governments exist to actually provide those public goods. But the truth is that in many countries, many low and middle income countries, the governments are not providing those public goods. They're stealing the money, right? And the reason for it is that in the resource-rich countries and in the aid-dependent countries, I might add, the governments are not accountable for their spending. because they're not coming from taxpayers in those countries. They're coming from taxpayers in other countries or oil consumers in other countries. So you could think of a situation where, say, a resource-rich country hands over all the revenues as cash transfers to the citizens and then taxes them to finance public goods. And we can show, I mean, I've been doing some research on this recently, can show that that actually can lead to greater accountability by the governments than what you have now, which is really no accountability.
Go ahead, Rory.
I think this is all fascinating. I mean, I just keep encouraging people to try to do, because Stefan and I went through this very painfully with DFID, where we found ourselves dealing with an incredible buildup of particularly conservative political opposition to the 0.7% that we were spending, that eventually led to the merging of the department and our cutting of our budget. And one of the things that is going on, one of the reasons people are not aware that DFID was doing this stuff before Give Directly is, of course, DFID did it almost in secret. It's very, very difficult to find very much information about what DFID was doing on cash transfers on the web. I went very carefully through their testimony to parliamentary committees, through their strategic plans, through their statements, because at some level, subconsciously, DFID officials must have sensed that what they were doing was not something that was going to be very popular with the public and that they would find very difficult to sell to the public. Right? Now, it's very easy for technocrats to say, well, that's fine. We've got the right answer. We've done the right research. This is the right thing to do. And foolish populist public, they don't understand what we're doing. So we'll just keep doing it and we'll just not tell you about it. Right? But it doesn't work. Right? It blows up in your face eventually. Right? You need to have projects that the public can relate to. And this too, I think, is the problem with Shanta's wonderful idea that we give all the money in cash transfers to people in Gabon, and the government of Gabon then taxes those people and puts the money into the Gabon budget and then spends it out. I really doubt that you are going to be able to say to the British taxpayer, we are going to take £10 billion a year off you. And the way we're going to spend it is we're going to hand it out in cash to all these people in Gabon. And then the Gabon government is going to tax our cash and put it back. And this Gabon president, who we might not approve of, is then going to have discretion over how to spend it, right? So the problem underlying the whole thing is that, understandably, there's a culture that assumes that if research economists come up with the right model, we can somehow trick the public in wealthy countries into providing their money in order to follow through on these schemes. But we can't, because we are failing to understand the type of emotional, empathetic arguments that you would actually need to make to the public to actually believe in what's happening. And that's also why certain kinds of things which we've stopped doing, we may need to think about doing again. So it's extremely unfashionable, for example, and has been probably since the 1950s, for internationals to try to run high quality institutions in other people's countries. And it's possible to do, right? The Aga Khan Development Network runs an extremely good nursing school in East Africa, right? You can find examples of doing this. And my instinct is that you could sell to Swedish voters, Swiss voters, British voters, American voters, we are running a fantastic university here. We're running a fantastic hospital here. But it's profoundly offensive to development economists. It's profoundly offensive to the academic world. And one of the problems that I had as a politician is trying to get people to be practical about what kind of things you should do on the ground that would actually excite a domestic public, make them feel there's something to look at, something they can be proud of, something tangible that they can see. And I think we fool ourselves into thinking that we can sell things that are fundamentally unsellable.
Thank you, Rory. Well put. And we just have a few minutes left. I can't believe it. This conversation has flown by. But I want to come back to each of you, because in terms of the why now of this conversation, one key reason in terms of why to have this conversation now is, as I mentioned at the outset, the UN General Assembly. So it kicks off today. There will be several weeks. Next week is kind of the key week, but several weeks of big conversations that sort of take the SDGs as a given, right? Like the SDGs as a starting point, and then talking about how have we done, how can we, get to zero, achieve these goals by 2030, et cetera. I think it's really valuable to create this space to challenge the whole notion of the SDGs and talk about Reimagining Sustainable Development and Reimagining Aid. So thank you to Rory and our panelists for sharing your insights on this. But before we close, given that the UN General Assembly is now underway, I would love to just go back to each of you and hear if you could gather all these leaders who are coming together to discuss progress on the goals with 2030 coming up and lots of challenges posed to progress. In fact, we've actually regressed on a lot of these goals over the course of the pandemic. What would your key message be? And perhaps we'll start with Shanta and Stefan and then close with Rory. But Shanta, can I start with you?
Okay. My key message to the leaders gathering at the UN General Assembly is actually derived from our conversation here, which is, if you want to achieve progress on the SDGs, you have to be more accountable to your own people. That's where you are failing. And I'll be very blunt about it. Now, as I was saying earlier, I think the aid establishment may have contributed to this lack of accountability or weakening of accountability. So we have to do our part as well. But this is one criticism I have of the SDGs, is that we have 17 goals. But there's one goal, I think it's goal 16, which is the one on governance. That is primordial. That's the goal that's going to generate all the other goals. But since it's number 16 of 17, it's easy to say, well, we'll focus on the other 3 or 4 of the other 17 and not take seriously that one goal. And that's my message to all these leaders.
Yeah, that is absolutely cross-cutting and foundational. Agreed. Stefan, what about you? What would your message be?
My message would be, potentially it's a version of it, although I always struggle with the word accountability because it also gets interpreted in so many different ways. But my message to them would be is that I probably would put them in 2 groups. There are some countries in their own way probably committed to development, to growth, to actually doing some of the longer term things. And I wish I could, on behalf of, say, even my department, say, look, we'll support you in that quest. We allow you to gamble on development. And then I would take that other group there and say, look, don't expect us to keep on just trying to compensate for you, because actually, for the reason that Rory says, we can't really permanently overcome the fact that you not want to do this. But if you show commitment to doing some of these things, and maybe in Shanta's words, if you show accountability, we will be there and we will want to support you. But it means also, we can't just in general say, we'll write you a check anyway. We'll just be there as outsiders. Aid is a bit like dancing the tango. If you're not both committed, it's going to go very, very wrong.
I love that analogy, and surprisingly had not heard it before, but that's great. Rory, we'll close with you. What would your message be?
I think moderation, pragmatic messaging. The biggest danger in international development is that we produce these utopian dreams. And in doing so, we are going to inevitably disillusion ourselves, alienate our public, destroy the credibility of our entire project, and run the risk that we lurch from utopian dreams to sudden extreme cutbacks, abandonment. The UK government has just brought through, in effect, 70–80% cuts in many of these fragile conflict-affected states in its programming because of the way it structured its budgets. And it ended up doing that in part because of this ridiculous cycle between fairy story and isolation. So unless we can get ourselves to framing a moderate, pragmatic way of talking about development that embraces the fact that there will be partial successes, partial failures, that things on the ground are going to look very messy, and that we're going to partner together and listen together in the way that we would with difficult communities or challenged communities in the United States or Europe, communities that we would expect to work with over 50, 60 years and don't have all the answers to, we're going to find ourselves in a hysterical, unsustainable situation. We need to keep faith and hope. And hope, above all, needs to be rooted in realism.
Thank you, Rory. It's a powerful way to close. We probably should just end it at that, but I did want to quickly say, for those of you who are joining us for the first time or unaware, this is part of a series, and it's the 8th in the series of the Yale Development Dialogues. And I'm super grateful to moderate these conversations, bringing together insights from history and economics and policy. It's really rare to have these kinds of candid conversations on such critical issues affecting all countries, really. And I can't think of a more timely, important topic as this one. So thank you again to Rory and to Shanta and to Stefan for taking the time to tackle this big question about reimagining sustainable development and aid as the UN General Assembly kicks off. And stay tuned for our upcoming conversations tackling some other big topics on health, on climate, and we'll conclude this fall semester, for those of you following the academic year, we'll conclude the year with a conversation on Afghanistan. So thank you all, and we'll see you next time.